Ellen Last, partner and co-founder at Sprint52. And so the first question, obviously, is like, tell people about your business. What do you do?
Sure. So Sprint52 is a business consulting company that is really focused on design thinking and specifically on design sprints, which is a process that was invented by Google Ventures to essentially help companies solve problems very quickly, like as in short as 4 days long.
Okay.
By using a recipe based on design thinking.
And what's the 52?
Because we're going to sprint 52 weeks a year.
Okay, that's a lot of sprinting.
Yes. Once we remembered how many weeks there were in a year, then
that's how you get the name.
52, yes.
Okay. So how did you get into this business? I'm always curious about because this seems very, and you and I talked about this a little before, of this is a very counterintuitive way of thinking about things, approaching problems. So how do you actually get into this business?
Yeah, I think accidentally. I mean, that's sort of how it happened for me. And I've been a product manager for the last 10 years. So, working with teams and designing software, various different software solutions in education and e-commerce and at Lego, at a big global corporation. And so, through one of those experiences, got exposed to this idea of a design sprint.
Okay.
And, after having witnessed software teams spend months and months and months, numerous times of building software, which turns out to be was the wrong solution, got exposed to this process that sort of took the time up front, not a ton of time, but 4 days, 5 days up front to really figure out what is the right solution, and was just really sort of blown away by the results of that and got really geeky about this process and very passionate about it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that you're talking about slowing things down a little bit in the beginning. Have you read the book, Never Split the Difference?
I know that book. It's on my list, but I also have a really high blog.
I actually saw one of your Instagram pictures the other day of the stack of books, and I'm like, I know some of those.
Yeah.
But yeah, in that book, well, he doesn't talk about it in the book, but I watched several interviews with Chris Voss, the guy who wrote it, and he talks a lot about slowing down to speed up.
Yes.
Which is
exactly.
Yeah, such an interesting, and again, counterintuitive.
And companies don't want to do that. They don't want to slow down. What is the cheapest, quickest thing we can do today? Not realizing that the cheapest, quickest thing they can do in the long term is to step back for a second.
Why do you think that is? Is it let me ask a higher level, not a higher level question, but one step behind that. Is that mostly big governments and big organizations, or is it small companies, or just sort of across the board?
I have found that there's no discrepancy in terms of this take. And I imagine there has to be companies out there that do not feel this way. But, I think that companies, especially companies that have been around for a long time, just sort of assume they know the problems and assume they know the solutions, right? And maybe they did at one point, but our world is constantly changing. Right. The problem doesn't stay constant. The consumer doesn't stay constant. Right. And so, but I think there's a lot of assumptions. We don't need to go back. We know what we need to do. And I don't think that's actually the case in a lot of instances.
So why do you think people do that? Why do you think people just go with assumptions instead of questioning their assumptions? Because that's really what you have to do in order to do something like this, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it comes back to that, that growth mindedness, right? I mean, and I feel I interact with a lot of people that are very growth minded and sort of let those assumptions go and search for the things that they don't know.
Right.
But, I mean, sometimes you have leadership or people at the top that don't necessarily have they've had so much success and maybe they have so much confidence that they can't really humble themselves to say maybe they don't know everything and I've just found the companies that I've been the ones that don't rely on those assumptions and that search for the stuff they don't know end up being the most innovative and in the position to make the most change. And those are the companies that we've had a lot of success working with at Sprint52.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it would stand to reason that the people that would have the most success are the ones that are most open to doing things a different way.
And I don't want to say that all leaders are egotistical maniacs, but they got to that position of success and power for a reason. They're obviously not dummies. But I think you always have to be asking yourself what you don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's like, and we talked about this before. It's just baffling to me. And part of it is too, is like, I'm approaching this conversation like with the perspective that like, this totally makes sense,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So like, it's easy for me to be a proponent of something like this.
Right.
But again, what's crazy is it's like a thing that once you see it, like it cannot be unseen, right? It's like because my background being like a marketing person, which is a lot of like heavy branding and a lot of like spending a lot of money and wasting money on things like without a lot of thought behind it. They have exactly what they want to do, right? And my first question is like, is this really going to do anything? Is it going to do anything?
Exactly.
Like it's just crazy to me that I guess people wouldn't seek out some way to try to find out, like, are we doing the right thing? Is there a better alternative here? It's just like baffling to me that people would just start barreling down the track. But then again, it's easy for me to say that because like now the blinders have been taken off, but like that's what I was doing before like I realized any of this stuff or thought about it, you know what I mean? So
yeah, and I mean that really resonates with me too because when I think about how I was doing product management like 10 years ago, I'm like embarrassed. Like what was I doing? So I think you're right. Like you can't unsee it now that I'm like, oh duh. So I get that.
Right, yeah, it seems so. Once you think about it a little, oh gosh, what's the deal? Somebody's like blowing me up in the middle of this thing. Me too. I thought my thing was turned off. Let me just like, I mean like 2 in a row. What's the deal? And it's like, it's in Connecticut. So like, and it's definitely not my wife's phone.
Okay.
So like, basically there's no one from Connecticut that it has such an emergency that they need to talk to me right now.
Let's hope not.
Yeah. So we talked about kind of how common it is, which is like seemingly not that common, like common sense, I guess.
Right. Yep.
Do you record the meetings that you do when you come in and do like a workshop for people? Do you record those? Because there was a guy that I'll just let you answer that. Do you record?
No,
those
we
meetings?
don't. But
Okay.
I like that idea. We do try to get feedback after the fact because just like our conversation right now, like. We don't want to assume that we just hit it out of the park. So we always ask for feedback, and we have like a standard form that we send out. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really the reason I asked that question is because have you read the book Ready, Fire, Aim?
No. Do I need to add that to my wish list?
That's one of the best books, best business books I've ever read, along with Never Split the Difference. Those are like probably one of the top 5.
Okay.
But he talks about like anytime you're like brainstorming or problem solving or anything like that, like you should record the meeting because like somebody inevitably will say something that's like unlocks a whole new thing, and then like everybody gets pumped up in the moment and you lose the trail after a little while, but at least that way you can go back and like listen and be like, oh yeah, that was really good. Or oftentimes what I've discovered as I've like made copious amounts of notes is like, this is dumb. This doesn't make any sense, but like, okay, at least you know.
Seemed like it.
Right.
So that's interesting that when you put it that way though, because we don't audio record our meetings, but we do typically just by the nature of our work, because we love killing trees with Post-it notes.
Okay.
So we end up having almost like a transcript of the meeting because a lot of our work, like a lot of what we do when we're in the room is less about talking and more about what we call working alone together and sort of, having individuals having that time to do some of that deep thinking, not worrying about, I'm going to add on to what Justin's saying, more thinking about like, okay, now that we've looked at the problem, what are my ideas, what are my thoughts on this, and recording them on sticky notes. So we end up doing a lot of transcribing, but you'll have almost like a whole record of everything, all the ideas and everything that came out during the meeting.
So that brings up an interesting question.
Yeah.
Or something that I'm interested in. What's the process like when people hire you to come in? Like, what is that like?
Yeah. So we're big fans, and one of your prep questions was about resources that we use. So like if Sprint52 were to have a Bible, the Bible is the Sprint book by Jake Knapp, who is sort of the inventor of this process, and we are major fans of Jake Knapp. We will follow, wherever he goes, we will be there. And we'll read all of his books. But I think that's sort of like the beauty of this process is it's just it's plain as day, and is broken up, day by day, and it follows the phases of design thinking. So like that very first day or half day, you're just focusing on the problem, right? And we try to set people up to be like, pressure's off today. You don't have to come up with any great, amazing ideas. Today, we're just looking at the problem.
Right.
So you bring in experts, you'll make a map, you really visually look at the problem, right? We have all these ideas in our head, but let's all look at it and agree that this is the problem. And then you go into sort of the next day when you start to define, because, a lot of these problems that we're dealing with are complex. You can't solve the whole thing, and that's part of the process is figuring out what is the most important piece of that problem that we need to solve for first. We'll get to the other pieces, but in order to do this right, we've sort of got to go step by step. And then you go into an ideation phase, and we have different exercises to get people's creativity juices flowing, so that they go through a process and get to a point where each individual in the room has a well thought out idea that's based on the problem that we spent a ton of time looking at.
Gotcha.
And then you go through sort of a decision-making process. We do a lot of voting. We use stickers to prioritize problems.
Oh, right, I've seen that.
Yeah. You have a decider in the room who gets guidance from the group, but ultimately there is somebody we know this at companies, or that might be part of the team that ultimately can say, okay, there might be a lot of great paths here, but at some point we've got to pick something. And then you go into the prototyping phase. So we've got our solution, we've decided the direction we're going to go. Now we've got to fake it so that we can get some data. And so you'll spend time coming up with a prototype, making an actual prototype that you can put in front of your user in order to get feedback. And so that's the last phase of the process, is to actually test that prototype, get data from your user, and then decide what changes or updates do you need to make to that solution before you now go spend all the money, time, and resources to build it.
So how to, as far as when companies or government, whatever organizations have you come in, do they typically just bring you in one time and you sort of oversee the facilitation of this process and then they can do it themselves from then on? Or do they have you come back multiple times or work with different teams? How does that work?
Yeah, and I think the answer to that has sort of been varied. And I think something that we've learned in Connecticut, and I think, there's a lot of great energy and stuff going on here in Connecticut. And to date, we have had a local focus because we love Connecticut, we love our state. We want to sort of help Connecticut, come up to speed with our friends to the north and south, New York, Boston.
Yeah.
And so we've been really trying to take this process and adapt it for each company and make it, what they need at that particular moment. But we really do focus on, helping them to really know what that problem is and come up with a solution so that they can then take that solution and decide what to do with it. And maybe that's go to another agency. And we would love to partner, we are working to partner with other organizations that can sort of take it, because our expertise is in defining the problem and the solution, and not necessarily building the thing. And so, we work to partner with other organizations that can then take it to the next leg.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Although I will say we've had companies bring us back for other problems. They're like, that was so great. Can you help us now with this problem? And we're like, heck yeah, we'll come back.
So one of the things that I have in my notes here, and I'm not exactly sure where I got this from. I think it was from one of your Instagram posts, starting with the end in mind.
Yes.
That, again, counterintuitive thing that seems, once you think about it like that, it seems so obvious to say, here's the objective. Okay, now we're going to figure out how to walk to this goal or get to this goal, instead of just randomly diffusing effort out and having absolutely no focus.
Totally.
like why do you feel, and it's maybe piggybacks on the previous question, but like why do you feel like people have such a diffuse focus, right? I mean, they just have no focus. I see a lot of people, fall into this trap of just like sort of aimlessly doing things with no end in mind.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is like one of those, coming back to our conversation about like, once you know something, you're like, oh my gosh, why was I not doing that before? The whole start at the end thing to me is like, obviously. But again, I think that's another place where there's just so many assumptions that come in. You sit in a meeting, even just like at a very small scale, you sit in a meeting and everybody thinks they know what the goal of the meeting is, but nobody actually says at the beginning, what is the goal of this meeting? What do we want to have accomplished when we leave this meeting? So, whether it's a short workshop, because we'll do everything from like an hour and a half workshop to a 4-day sprint, that's the first thing we start with, and not necessarily talking about like what outcome do we want to have at the end of this meeting, but thinking about the work that we're talking about today. If you look 6 months in advance and you were to look back on this and this was going to be a smashing success, what does that look like?
Right.
And really put that out on the table.
Right.
I take a lot of inspiration, and not to talk about a huge mammoth company, Amazon, but like they have and I don't know if they still do this, but I know it's something they've done in the past, whereas they sort of start each initiative by writing the press release for that initiative. Mm-hmm. And so I always think about that, and I'll bring up that example, and people are like, oh, that's so interesting. And I'm asking what I think is a very obvious question, and people are like, we've never asked it like that. So starting at the end is probably the crux of the whole thing. Like if you don't start at the end, then you're doomed. Yeah,
I mean, it's like strategy, right? Like people are like, what's the value of strategy? Like I don't want to pay for strategy is everything. Exactly. That's it. Exactly. Like if you're trying to get to Boston and you're pointing towards LA, you will never get. That's the thing. It's not even like we want to get to Boston. We're pointing towards LA. It's like, where do you want to go today? It's like, just start flying.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't know.
Exactly. Just
get it up in the air, or just start flying around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan too of the OKR framework, the objectives and key results. Okay. And that's really what it is. I think companies have very complicated, goals, structures, but the OKR structure is very popular in startups, and it's so simple. Right. The objective is, where are we going? Like when I wake up in the morning, like what is making me jump out of bed to go to work? Like I'm here to save children, and then the key results, and it's just 2 or 3 metrics to say, well, how do we know if we're getting in that direction, saving children? And it's so simple, but for me, it's just everything.
Yeah, people are really good at overcomplicating things.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's. I mean, the most successful things tend to be the simple. It seems so obvious, right? Like, oh, Amazon or whatever it is. You know what I mean? Right. Something that's like, oh, it seems so obvious. I could have done that. It's not that hard.
Exactly.
But like, no, it's hard because it's so simple, right? It looks easy, but it's hard to keep that focus because that starts exactly to widen really. Oh, well, they're asking about this thing now. Mm-hmm. Should we build a team to do this thing? Like, well, what about this? There's a lot of opportunity over here too, and suddenly you're just stuck in this quagmire thing.
And businesses are complicated, and they only get more complicated as you scale. So it's harder to stick with that focus and keep with that lean startup mindset. Right. But you have to. I've seen so many companies just try to be everything to everyone, and you just can't. Right. You won't find success that way. You'll just end up being not very good at a lot of things.
So, because I feel like people understand that and realize that they've heard it enough, but why is that still? And I know I'm asking you these big philosophical Because
if you know the answer to that, then it will help my business a lot. I don't know. I think you end up having so many different stakeholders, right? You're trying to serve so many different audiences. You have different leaders at the top that might have a variation in ways they think the company can and should go. The bigger you get, the longer you've been around, the more complex things get, and that focus becomes more and more difficult. Right. But I don't know. I wish I knew the answer to these simple concepts, because sometimes I go in and I've been doing this work for so long now, and I've read so much about it, and I'm such a nerd about all of it that it just seems like so obvious to me now. And I think a lot of times you take for granted, right, the experience you have. Like you forget all the stuff and experience you have in your head. So sometimes I go in and I'm like, I hope they don't think like, is this elementary? You know?
Right.
But it's not. I mean, people overcomplicate things.
Right.
I mean, plain and simple.
Yeah.
Companies overcomplicate things.
One of the things I saw in your Instagram feed was a Post-it note that said HMW.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting. Instead of, what was remind me of like what the caption was? It wasn't so much like should we or shouldn't we, but it was like instead of like framing the problem as a way to like solve it, I guess.
Yeah.
Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, how might we, I believe it was like, I think Procter & Gamble came up with how might we in the 70s. And it's something that we use a lot in our workshops and during a sprint. And it's in the Sprint book by Jay Knapp, which is, sort of taking, when you throw, we could throw a ton of problems up on the board and it's like, oh my gosh, there's so many problems, we're never going to be able to do this, right? But it's just flipping the thinking and changing it from a problem into just a question that needs some answers.
Right.
And it also standardizes sort of people's thoughts, right? Like you might write a problem in one way and I might write it using different words. So if we can, write it as a question, how might we save the lives of children instead? I don't know why I keep saying save children's lives. Like I don't even know what problem that could be. But putting it into a question because then it just flips it and it gets people thinking about solutions as opposed to all the insurmountable things that we're never going to be able to figure out.
Yeah, there's this guy named Bo Lotto. Do you know who that is?
I don't know him.
I don't know if I told you about this before. He's like, I'm going to get this completely wrong. But he basically is like a psychologist, like studies how people think and the way we make decisions. One of the things that he said in this on this YouTube video, I'll send you a link to it because I think you might find it interesting. I've watched it several times and I constantly am hearing his like voice like say this in my head, which is like nothing interesting begins with an answer, it begins with a question. It begins with a why, it begins with a what if.
Yeah.
And like that is the thing, that's the thing, is the way to solving bigger problems is to ask better questions. That was like revolutionary in my mind when I like kind of wrapped my head around that. It's not from having the answers.
Yeah.
You will never have all the answers, but what you can get really good at finding answers is by asking questions, and that's really the only way to do it, as far as like I know. But
totally. Yeah, and actually last week I did a sort of a fun program with Hartford Public Schools to help expose Hartford Public High School kids to just sort of the software development process and had them come up with problems they were going to solve. They sort of form their own startups, and I introduced them to the concept of how might we's. Right. And they went from, just like one example, one group was like, we're going to solve climate change. Well, that's a big problem. There's so many elements of that, right? And so after working with them a little bit, they went from, we're going to solve the problems of climate change to how might we get all politicians on board with the cause of climate change. Right. And so now you've got a much more focused problem that you can solve for than this big, big problem that you could go so many different ways to solve it.
Do you feel like that's one of the benefits that organizations have by bringing in a team like yours, is like helping them like chunk out this huge problem that seems insurmountable?
And frame the thinking, right?
Right.
Yes. And just bringing that out. Sometimes you're too close to the problem. And I'm a victim of that as a product manager, right? Like I've worked on projects for years and years and years. I know the ins and outs. I know what button this goes to, but having somebody come out from the outside with those fresh eyes that can just organize your thinking, right? It's a framework. Yeah. Because we get stuck in a rut of thinking about the same thing and having the same process over and over. So it's just sort of like the electric shock treatment to be like, we're going to approach this differently.
Yeah, it reminds me, you talking about, that reminds me of, I heard somebody describe like having a consultant or a coach or something. It's the difference between trying to read the label on a bottle from the inside versus somebody like reading the label to you on the outside.
Right.
It's like
Yeah.
really hard. It's, I won't say easy, but like you almost, that's an almost impossible task to try to like, like a doctor, to try to,
Exactly.
Diagnose what problems you actually have.
I think it's like tickling. Like you can't tickle yourself.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Somebody else has to
Right.
tickle you.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. Let me get to my next thing here. Oh, the graph. As far as like, graphing like ideas. As far as what I have here is like it helps break down the misconceptions that ideas are either good or bad. So talk about that a little bit of like graphing. Is it graphing problems or it's graphing solutions? You might not even know what I'm talking about. I just have like a little note here.
I don't know if you're talking about the effort impact matrix. Is that what you said?
Maybe go into that a little bit.
So the effort.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly it.
I am a huge fan of this tool, effort impact matrix, because just like problems are complex and there's a lot of different ways to solve them, like you can't pursue all of those solutions at the same time, because you just can't. You've got to do. It's a very step by step process, right? This is what this whole model is about. It's like fixing one thing at a time in order to drive that change or that growth that you're trying to go for. So we will do like a workshop. It's called a lightning decision jam, and it'll end in an effort impact matrix. So you take all these great solutions that people have sort of voted on and said they like, and maybe you've got 10 solutions. Well, you can't produce them all. So as a group, we make a graph, and on one side of that matrix is effort. Whether it's going to be how much effort is this solution going to be to implement? Is it going to be very, very high effort, or is this like super easy? We could do this in our sleep. Versus impact. So if we were to implement this solution, how impactful would it be to that end goal that we discussed at the beginning of the meeting? Would it impact it a ton, or would it just move the needle a little? And again, another activity where we try to do less talking as opposed to more talking. The facilitator will sort of put each solution in the middle. It's like, well, is it on this side of effort or is it on the low side of effort? And so what you end with is 4 sort of quadrants. And when in the quadrant that's the lowest effort, highest impact, those are the solutions you should pursue.
So no brainer stuff.
Exactly.